She arrived in Wyoming with 2 trunks, a cast iron skillet, and a husband who hadn't looked her in the eye yet. Everyone at Blackstone Ranch thought they knew exactly what Marin Holloway was. A mail-order wife bought to cook and stay quiet. The ranch hands laughed behind her back. Her own husband barely spoke to her. And the bank? The bank was already writing them off. But while everyone else was watching the ground dry up and crumble, Marin was watching something else entirely. And what she saw was about to change everything. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The wagon that brought Marin Holloway to Blackstone Ranch had a cracked wheel and a driver who smelled like he'd been drinking since Laramie. She sat on the bench beside him for 6 hours, watching the Wyoming landscape flatten out into something that felt less like country and more like a warning. Brown grass, gray sky, the occasional skeleton of a cottonwood tree that had given up sometime in the last decade. She kept her hands folded in her lap and didn't say much. The driver, a lean old man named Cutter, who had the conversational habits of a fence post, offered her exactly 3 sentences the entire ride. The ranch was about 4 miles out, the foreman was named Dalt, and she shouldn't expect much. She didn't. Elias Rowan was standing outside the barn when the wagon rolled in, and Marin's first impression of her new husband was that he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in about 2 years. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw set so tight it might have been carved from the same rock as the surrounding hills. He watched the wagon approach without moving. When Cutter hauled back on the reins and the horses stamped to a stop, Elias walked over and offered Marin his hand to climb down. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. "Mr. Rowan," she said back. That was it. That was the whole greeting. He carried her trunks inside himself, which she appreciated, and showed her to a room off the back of the main house that had a window facing west and a mattress that had seen better years. There was a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, faded blue and yellow, worn soft at the edges, and she touched it briefly, wondering who had made it. "Kitchen's through there," Elias said, nodding toward the door. "Hands eat at 6 and again at noon. There's 15 of them right now, might be more come spring. Supplies come in from Harwick twice a month." He paused. "I expect you know what you signed on for." "I do," Marin said. He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, but not warmly either, the way a man looks at a new piece of equipment he's not sure will hold up. And then he left her alone in the room. She stood there for a minute, listening to the sounds of the ranch settle around her. Wind against the clappered siding, cattle somewhere in the distance, unhappy about something. Men's voices from the direction of the bunkhouse. She unpacked the first trunk, hung her dresses on the 3 hooks behind the door, set her brush and comb on the small dresser, and then she went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was bigger than she'd expected, and in considerably worse shape. There was a wood-burning range along the far wall that looked functional, but was thick with grease that had been cooking onto the iron for so long it had turned almost geological. The work table in the center was sturdy pine, scarred from years of use, stained with everything a ranch kitchen produces over a decade. The pantry off to the right held flour, dried beans, salt pork, some cornmeal, a sack of coffee that had been open too long. One window above the dry sink looked out toward the corral. Through it, she could see 2 ranch hands leaning against the fence, both watching the house with the particular idle curiosity of men who had been talking about her arrival all week. She ignored them and started a fire in the range. By the time the men came in for supper, she had cornbread in a pan, beans simmered down with the salt pork and what onions she could find, and a pot of coffee that was at least hot and strong. It wasn't elaborate. She hadn't had time to be elaborate, but she set it out on the table and rang the bell outside the back door the way she'd seen indicated in the small diagram Elias had left on the work table. A single sheet of paper with the meal schedule, the supply list, and the names of the ranch hands written in a handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, like a man who had taught himself to write from a book. The men came in loud and sat down loud and ate the way men eat when food is fuel and conversation is noise. Marin stood near the range and watched them. Most of them didn't look at her. A few did, the kind of looking that sizes a person up and reaches a conclusion before anything has actually happened. One of them, a thick-necked man with a red beard who sat at the far end of the table, said to the man next to him, not particularly quietly, "Thought she'd be younger." The man next to him, younger himself, maybe 20, with the sunburned look of someone who'd grown up outdoors, said, "Thought the beans would have more to them." There was some laughter. Myron refilled the coffee pot and said nothing. She had known, when she answered the advertisement in the back pages of the Omaha paper 8 weeks ago, that she was not walking into warmth. The advertisement had been practical to the point of bluntness. Rancher 34, Wyoming Territory, seeks capable woman for household management and cooking. Hard work expected. Fair treatment guaranteed. Respond with references to E. Rowan, Blackstone Ranch, Harwick County. She had written back with her references and a short letter describing her experience. She'd run the kitchen at a boarding house in Sioux Falls for 3 years after her father died, and the farm had to be sold. She could cook for crowds. She knew how to stretch supplies. She did not need comfort or conversation to function. What she had not anticipated exactly was the particular flavor of being invisible. It wasn't malicious, most of it. These men simply did not think of her as a person in the same category as themselves. She was a fixture, like the range or the work table, useful, stationary. She had understood this intellectually before she arrived, but understanding something and inhabiting it were two different things. She washed the dishes after supper alone, listening to the men's voices fade toward the bunkhouse, and through the window she watched the Wyoming dark come down fast and total over the empty hills. Well, Elias came to the kitchen after the men had gone. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd left on the back of the range and stood near the window with it. He looked like he'd been outside all day. There was dust on his collar and something tired around his eyes that wasn't just physical. "Supper was fine," he said. "Thank you." He turned the cup in his hands. "I want to be straight with you about where things stand," he said. "The ranch is behind. 3 years of drought, cattle prices dropped out. We had a run of illness through the herd 2 winters back. The bank in Harwick has been patient, but they won't be patient forever." He paused. "I didn't bring you here under false pretenses. The advertisement said hard work. That's what this is." "I understood that," Marin said. "I just wanted to be clear." He set the cup down. "You'll have what you need for the kitchen. I'll make sure of that. Anything else you need, you tell me." She almost said all right and let him go. Instead, she said, "Can I ask you something?" He looked at her, slightly surprised that she had more words in her. "That camp down the draw," she said. "The railroad workers. How far is that from here?" Elias blinked. 2, maybe 2.5 miles. Why? "How many men are working there? This time of year?" He thought about it. 200-300. Could be more by spring, the way the surveys are running. Marin nodded slowly. She'd seen the camp from the wagon on the way in, or rather, she'd seen the smoke from it, a thick column rising from somewhere south and east, and she'd asked Cutter what it was. He'd said railroad, said it like it was nothing interesting, like 300 men living in tents in the middle of Wyoming was just weather. "Are they fed well?" she asked. Elias looked at her with something that might have been caution. "Camp cook feeds them. Basic rations. It's not a complaint situation out there. Men eat what there is." "Men always complain about food," Marin said. "They just don't always have somewhere else to go." Elias was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" She almost didn't say it. She had been in this house for approximately 6 hours, and she knew very well what kind of reception an idea like this would get from a man who was watching his ranch come apart at the seams. But she had seen the smoke from 2.5 miles away, and she had done the arithmetic in her head during the last half hour of the wagon ride, and the numbers were not small. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that 300 men who are eating bad food would pay real money for good food, if someone brought it to them." Elias stared at her. "I'm thinking the kitchen here is being used to feed 15 men twice a day," she continued, "and it could be doing considerably more than that. If we had a wagon, even one of the supply wagons fitted out with the range equipment, I could take hot meals out to that camp, charge by the plate, real prices, not charity prices." The silence that followed was long enough that she could hear the wind pick up outside. "You just got here," Elias said finally. "I know. You haven't even seen the whole ranch yet." "I know that too." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not dismissal exactly, but something adjacent to it, like a man who has heard an idea that's too large for the moment he's standing in. "Get settled first," he said. "We can talk." He picked up his cup, rinsed it in the dry sink with water from the pitcher, and set it on the shelf. Then he walked out of the kitchen without saying goodnight. Marin stood in the kitchen alone, listening to his footsteps cross the main room, and then the sound of a door closing somewhere. She turned back to the range, banked the fire for the night, and started thinking about wagons. Well, the first 2 weeks at Blackstone Ranch were an education in the particular miseries of a failing operation. The cattle were thin, not dangerously, but visibly, the way animals get when the grass has been poor for too long and the supplemental hay runs short before spring. The fencing on the north pasture had sections that needed replacing, and Marin could see from the kitchen window that Elias and 2 of the hands were out there most mornings doing patchwork that was never quite enough. The equipment barn held a hay rake with a broken tooth, a plow that looked like it had been repaired so many times it was more repair than original, and a wagon with a cracked axle that had been sitting untouched long enough to collect a significant amount of bird activity on top. The men had sorted themselves in her mind by name and character within the first week. The red-bearded one was Gus Prater, the foreman's second, loud and not particularly subtle in his opinions. The young sunburned one was Cal, who was actually not bad company once he stopped trying to be impressive, and just talked like a person. There was an older hand named Dalt, who ran things quietly and efficiently and had the habit of showing up exactly when something needed doing, which Marin respected. The others filled in the space of the bunkhouse. Decent men, most of them, worn down by the same drought and difficulty that had worn down everything else on the property. They ate what she cooked without complaint, mostly, except for Gus, who had opinions about seasoning that he aired freely and that Marin ignored with the focused patience of a woman who had made food for strangers for 3 years and had no particular need for approval. She asked Elias about the wagon again at the end of the second week. They were in the main room after supper. He had taken to coming in for coffee after the men left, which she thought was probably the extent of what passed for domestic conversation in this household. And she had been thinking about timing. She had learned enough by now to know that Elias Rowan was not a man who responded well to pressure. He was a man who needed to arrive at decisions himself, which meant the best approach was to put information in front of him and wait. "I talked to some of the railroad men in Harwick," she said, without preamble. Elias looked up from the table where he'd been going over a ledger. The ledger was not making him happy. She had seen the expression on his face when he worked on it, the particular stillness of a man adding numbers that don't add up. "When did you go to Harwick?" "When Cal went for supplies on Thursday. I asked if I could ride along." She set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him, which was the first time she'd sat at the same table with him outside of a meal. He noticed, she could see it, but he didn't say anything about it. "There's a man named Briggs who does small contracting work for the railroad camp. I asked him about the food situation out there." "And?" "He said the men hate it. The camp cook is a man named Fawcett, who has the attitude that food is food, and hungry men will eat whatever they're given." Which is true, to a point. But Briggs said there's been 3 separate complaints filed with the railroad company foreman about the quality of the meals. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "He said if someone showed up with actual hot food, something that tasted like it was made by a person instead of an institution, the men would pay for it themselves, out of their own wages." Elias was quiet. "I asked him what they'd pay," Marin continued. "He said 25 cents a plate, easy. Probably more for something like pie." The number sat between them on the table. Elias looked at his ledger. He looked at the number she had just put in the air. "You've been planning this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to something like realization. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the first night." He leaned back in his chair. "The cracked axle wagon in the equipment barn," he said. "I noticed it. That axle would need replacing. Costs money we don't have sitting loose right now." "I know, but the ranch has timber. Dalt said there's a man in Harwick who does wheelwright work and will accept timber in trade." A pause. "You talked to Dalt?" "I asked him about the wagon. He said it could be made roadworthy." She looked at him directly. "Elias, the numbers on that camp, even at 20 cents a plate, feeding 100 men once a day is $20. That's $140 a week. That's more than the ranch takes in right now." She watched him do the arithmetic. She had done it herself a dozen times, from every angle, looking for the place where it fell apart. It kept not falling apart. "It's not just fixing the wagon," he said. "You'd need a stove set up on it, fuel, extra supplies, someone to drive. I can drive. You haven't driven a wagon rig in this country. I've driven wagons. Not like this. The draw road down to the camp is rough in dry weather. Spring comes and it'll be worse. Then teach me, she said, or come with me the first few times. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time that she could remember, with actual attention rather than the polite surface regard of two strangers sharing a house. She held his gaze because she had nothing to hide in it and no reason to look away. You're serious, he said. I was serious the first night I mentioned it. Another silence. Outside, the wind was doing something theatrical against the side of the house, and one of the horses in the near corral stamped and shifted. Elias tapped one finger on the ledger. Once, twice, the quiet fidget of a man making a decision. Let me look at the wagon in the morning, he said finally. I'm not saying yes, I'm saying let me look. Marin said, All right, Marin. She did not smile. She did not do anything that would make this feel like she had won something at his expense, because that wasn't what this was. She picked up the cups and took them back to the kitchen and washed them at the dry sink in the dark, and she let herself feel, privately, the small, careful spark of something that wasn't quite hope yet, but was adjacent to it. The wagon took 11 days to make roadworthy. Elias traded 6 good sections of timber to the wheelwright in Harwick for a new axle and fitting, and then he and Dalt and Cal spent 3 days on the replacement work, which went slowly and involved a great deal of profanity that drifted through the kitchen window while Marin was working. She found during this period that her standing among the ranch hands shifted in a way she hadn't expected, not toward warmth exactly, but toward something closer to attention. The men had heard pieces of the plan. They had opinions. Gus Prater had the most opinions. Going to drive a wagon into a railroad camp, he said, the morning the axle work started, leaning in the kitchen doorway while she was making bread. He had a way of making statements sound like challenges. 100 men or more, most of them rough as an unpainted board, and you think they'll line up polite and hand over money for your cooking. I think hungry men eat, Marin said, punching down the dough. I haven't found them to be that complicated. They'll take advantage. They'll eat and not pay. They'll cause trouble. Possibly. Possibly. He repeated the word like it meant something different in her mouth. That's it? Possibly? What would you like me to say, Gus? That I'm not doing it because something bad might happen? She shaped the loaves and set them to rise. Something bad might happen every time any of us walks out the door. That hasn't stopped the ranch from operating. Gus was quiet for a moment. Elias shouldn't let you do it alone. He's not. He's going to come the first few times. This seemed to deflate some argument Gus had been preparing. He chewed on something invisible for a moment and then said, Well, I suppose the axle work won't do itself, and left the doorway. Cal, who had been passing by with a length of timber and had heard the tail end of this, gave her a quick look through the window. It might have been respect. It was gone too fast to be certain. The range setup for the wagon was a problem that took longer to solve than the axle. Marin needed something that could hold a fire on an uneven moving surface and still be safe. Not a full range, but a modified box stove with a damper she could close for travel and a cast iron surface that would stay level on the wagon bed. She drew it out on paper one evening and showed it to Elias, who looked at it for a long time and then made 3 modifications without speaking, improving it in ways she hadn't seen. She hadn't known he had that kind of mechanical mind. She added it to the list of things she was learning about him. The stove was built by a metalworker in Harwick, another trade arrangement, this time 4 good cattle hides that Dalt had been holding. And it was fitted to the wagon bed on a Saturday morning while a thin snow fell and the entire crew stood around watching with the detached, critical attention men bring to any project they didn't initiate. When it was done, Elias stepped back and looked at it. Then he looked at Marin. Monday, he said. We go Monday. What? Sunday night, Marin did not sleep well. She lay in the room with the west-facing window and listened to the wind and ran through everything that could go wrong, which was a long list and took considerable time. The wagon could lose a wheel on the draw road. The stove could tip despite all precautions. The railroad men could refuse to pay, or refuse to line up, or be hostile in ways she hadn't anticipated. The camp foreman could send her away. The food could be wrong. Wrong for the scale, wrong for the conditions, wrong in some way she hadn't foreseen. She got up before 4 and went to the kitchen and started working. She made biscuits, 3 batches, nearly 200 of them, stacked in cloth-lined crates. She made a massive pot of beef stew with the good cuts she'd asked Elias to have butchered Friday, thick with carrots and onion and a handful of dried herbs she'd brought from Sioux Falls, because she'd known, walking into this, that she would need them. She made coffee, a full lard pail of it, strong enough to hold a spoon upright, and packed it in an insulated box with straw. She packed the dried apple pie she'd made Saturday. She packed salt and pepper in 3 clean ladles and a stack of tin cups and plates she'd traded for in Harwick with her own money. The last small reserve she'd carried from Sioux Falls folded into a handkerchief in the bottom of her second trunk. Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30, saw the scale of what she'd prepared, and said nothing. He drank his coffee standing up. Then he hitched the horses while she loaded the wagon. They were rolling by 6:15, in the gray pre-dawn cold, Marin on the bench beside Elias and the wagon creaking under its load behind them. The draw road was exactly as rough as he'd warned. A series of switchbacks cut into the hillside that required constant adjustment, and at 2 points the left rear wheel dropped into a rut deep enough that the whole wagon lurched, and she had to brace against the benchboard with both hands. Elias drove without comment, competent and steady, making the correction she didn't know enough yet to anticipate. 2.5 miles. In good weather on a decent road, it would have been nothing. On a cold March morning on a draw road with a loaded wagon, it was a commitment. They heard the camp before they saw it, the sounds of several hundred men beginning their day, the clatter of equipment, someone shouting something over the general noise. Then the camp came into view below them as the road made its last turn. A long row of canvas tents set in the creek bottom, smoke rising from the cook tent at the far end, horses and mules in a picket line, and men everywhere in various stages of the morning routine. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the camp. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Well," he said. "Well," she said back. She climbed down from the bench, opened the stove damper, and started the fire. It took about 15 minutes for the smell to begin. Biscuits warming on the iron, the stew heated back to a proper rolling steam, the coffee pail set over the secondary burner with its lid slightly ajar so the smell could get out. Marin had understood, from her years at the boarding house, that food is primarily a smell before it is anything else. Men follow their noses. It is not complicated. The first man came over out of simple curiosity, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the wagon with the expression of someone who isn't sure yet what he's seeing. He was maybe 40, heavy-set, with a beard that had grown somewhat beyond the intentional stage. "What's this?" he said. "Breakfast," Marin said. "Biscuits and stew, 20 cents. Coffee's a nickel." He looked at the stew. She lifted the lid so the steam could get out properly. "That real beef in there?" he said. "It is." He dug in his pocket, came up with a quarter and held it out. "Keep the change," he said. By the time she'd served him and turned around, there were 4 more men waiting. By 7:30, there were 40. Elias, who had been standing back with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who is still reserving judgment, walked around to the side of the wagon where Marin was working and picked up a ladle without being asked. He started serving. She handed plates across the counterboard, and he filled them, and the line kept moving and the money collected in the tin box under the counterboard. And at a certain point, Marin stopped being nervous and just worked, because this was what she knew how to do. This was the thing she had known how to do since she was 12 years old, learning beside her mother in the Kansas farmhouse kitchen, and it turned out that Wyoming was not so different from Kansas when it came to hungry men and hot food. At noon, when the last of the stew was gone, and the biscuits were down to crumbs, and the coffee pail was empty, Marin counted the tin box while Elias rehitched the horses. $23.40. One morning, 2.5 hours of actual service. She sat on the wagon bench with the tin box in her lap and the money in her hand and thought about the ledger she'd seen open on Elias's table. She thought about the numbers in it, the bank payment due in July, the winter feed costs still outstanding, the wage arrears from December that the men had agreed to defer until spring. She heard Elias come around the front of the wagon and climb up beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He took the reins and clicked the horses forward, starting them back up the draw road. After about 100 yards, he said, "That's more than I've taken in on a good week." "I know," Marin said, "in one morning." "I know." He was quiet for the climb up the draw, focused on the driving. At the top, where the road leveled out and the ranch buildings came back into view, he stopped the horses for a moment and sat there. "We're going to need more biscuits," he said. Maren looked at him. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackstone Ranch, he was looking at her with something that was neither assessment nor polite distance. It was something closer to the look one person gives another when they realize, with some surprise, that they have been standing next to something significant without knowing it. "We're going to need more everything," she said. He nodded once, slow, the way a man nods when he's making room for something new in a worldview that hasn't had much new in it for a while. Then he clicked the horses forward and drove them home. The second Monday they went out, Maren brought twice the food and came back with $41. The third Monday, she went out Tuesday and Wednesday as well, and came back each time with the tin box heavier than the last. By the end of the third week, she had a rough system. Biscuits and stew for breakfast service, something heartier at midday when she could manage the timing, pie when she had the supplies for it, always coffee, always more than she thought she'd need because she kept running out. The railroad men had started talking about the wagon among themselves, she could tell, because the lines got longer before she'd even finished setting up. Men who worked the far end of the grading site started walking over on their break specifically, which meant they were giving up rest time for the food, which meant the food was worth something real to them. She burned 3 batches of biscuits the second week because she misjudged the stove's behavior on the uneven ground at the camp's edge. And on the Thursday of that week, the wagon's rear board came loose during the drive down, and she lost a full crate of cornbread to the draw road, which put her in a black mood she didn't bother to hide. Elias, who had been driving, stopped to help her collect what could be salvaged and said nothing about it until they were back on the road. "We need to fix the board," he said. "I know we need to fix the board," she said. "I'll do it tonight." "I know you will." She stared at the road ahead. "I should have checked it myself this morning." "You had 400 biscuits to check. The board still should have been on the list." He didn't argue with that, which she appreciated more than reassurance would have been. What was changing, slowly, without either of them naming it directly, was the way they worked together. In the first weeks, Elias had come along to drive because the road was too rough for a woman alone with a loaded wagon, or at least that was the reason stated. But somewhere in the daily rhythm of loading and driving and setting up and serving and counting, they had stopped being 2 people in parallel and started being something more like a unit. He knew, without being told, when she needed the stove damper adjusted for a different wind. She knew, without being told, that if he went quiet on the drive home, it meant he was doing arithmetic in his head and needed to be left alone until he'd finished. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The men at the ranch noticed. Gus Prater, who noticed everything and commented on most of it, said one evening at supper, loudly to the table, "Elias looks less like he's about to walk into the river these days." Several of the hands laughed. Cal said, "Ranch looks different too." Gus shrugged his big shoulders. "Money does that." Maren, at the range, said nothing, but she heard it. By the 6th week, the pattern had outgrown what 1 wagon and 2 people could sustain. The problem was volume. 300 men in a railroad camp, and she was serving maybe 120 of them on a good day. The ones who could get to the wagon during the service window. The rest were at work sites too far from the camp edge to walk over on a break, or they were on the late shift, or they were the men who simply hadn't heard yet, which was a shrinking category. She was leaving money behind every single day, and she knew it, and it frustrated her in a way that kept her awake at night working through solutions. The other problem was supplies. Harwick's twice-monthly delivery was built for a ranch kitchen feeding 15 men, not a mobile operation feeding 100 and more. She had been supplementing with purchases in town, which ate into the margin, and the quality of what she could get through Harwick's single general store was inconsistent at best. She needed a real supply arrangement, a regular one, with someone who could guarantee volume and quality and show up on time. She talked to Elias about it on a Sunday afternoon. They had started doing this, meeting at the kitchen table after the midday meal when the hands were resting, going over the week's numbers and the next week's needs. It had started practically and stayed practical, but it had also become the time in the week when they talked most honestly. "I need a second wagon," she said. Elias set down his coffee. "We don't have a second wagon that's serviceable." "I know, But we have the materials to build out the old hay wagon if we pull the boards from the east pasture section that's been down since November anyway. She had already looked at this. She had already measured. And I know someone who might drive it. Who? Ada Marsh. Elias was quiet. Ada Marsh was a widow who lived on a small claim about 4 miles north. Her husband had died 2 winters back, horse accident, and she had been doing what widows on the Wyoming frontier did, which was survive by whatever means presented themselves. Marin had met her in Harwick at the general store, and they had talked for about 20 minutes, enough to know that Ada was sharp and capable, and entirely willing to work if the work paid. She's never worked a food operation, Elias said. She's cooked for herself and her husband and 2 farmhands for 8 years, and she needs the income. Marin, the camp is getting bigger. There's a survey crew coming in from the east next month, Briggs told me. Another 60 or 70 men. We cannot serve that camp with 1 wagon. She put her hand flat on the table, not to be dramatic, just to anchor herself. Elias, we have been doing this for 6 weeks. We have paid 2 months of the December wage arrears. We have put money on the July bank payment. I'm not asking to be reckless. I'm asking to scale what's already working. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who knows he's going to say yes and is taking a moment to make sure he means it. Talk to Ada, he said. Bring her out here so I can meet her before we decide anything. Marin nodded. I already told her I'd ask. Elias made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. Of course you did. All right. Ada Marsh came out on a Wednesday, drove herself in a battered single-horse buggy, and arrived while Marin was in the middle of prepping for the next morning. She was maybe 45, lean and weathered, with gray starting at her temples and hands that showed every year of frontier life she'd lived. She looked around the kitchen with the interested eye of a woman who runs her own operation and knows what she's looking at. You're doing this every day? Ada said, watching Marin work. 3 days a week right now. Going to 4 starting next month. Ada picked up one of the biscuit rounds and examined it like she was checking the density. These are good. What's your ratio? 3-to-1 flour to fat. Little more salt than most. Ada nodded slowly. I do mine different, but they come out close enough. She set it down. Your husband said I could look at the hay wagon. They went out to the equipment barn together. The hay wagon was larger than the cracked axle one, longer bed, higher sides, and it had been sitting unused long enough that a family of mice had taken up residence in the far corner of the bed. Ada walked around it, checked the wheel hubs, tested the board flex with her hands, looked at the tongue assembly. Elias was there, leaning against the barn door, watching her work through the inspection. Tongue needs new hardware, Ada said. Everything else is manageable. Hardware's not expensive, Elias said. No, it's not. Ada straightened up and looked at Marin. What are you paying? 30% of what your wagon takes in. You pay for your own supplies out of that and keep the rest. Ada thought about it. Not long. She was not a woman who needed long. What does a good day look like on that wagon? Yesterday we cleared $32 on the small wagon. A larger wagon with a longer service window should do better than that. Ada looked at the wagon again. She looked at the barn, at the ranch yard visible through the open doors, at the whole operation she was being invited into. I need to know I can trust the supply side, she said. If I show up and the flour's short or the beef isn't there, I can't serve, and I don't get paid. I'm building a supply arrangement with a wholesaler in Casper, Marin said. It's not finished yet, but it will be before you start. What if it falls through? Then I'll drive to Harwick at 4 in the morning if I have to. She said it flat and even because she meant it flat and even. Ada, I'm not going to put you in a wagon and send you down a rough road to a camp full of men and then leave you without what you need to do the job. That's not what this is. Ada studied her for a long moment. Then she looked at Elias. Your wife always like this? Elias said, apparently. Ada made a sound that was definitely a laugh. All right, she said, show me your biscuit recipe and we'll start from there. The supply arrangement took another 2 weeks to pull together, and it was messier than Marin had wanted. The wholesaler in Casper was a man named Thurgood, who ran a dry goods warehouse out of a building that smelled permanently of burlap and vinegar. He was skeptical, initially, of contracting with a ranch woman, which he expressed not by saying so outright, but by being consistently unavailable for the first 3 attempts Marin made to reach him. Once by letter, twice by making the 40-mile trip to Casper herself, which was a full day's journey each way and cost more than she could comfortably afford. The third visit to Casper. She didn't go to Thurgood's warehouse first. She went to the Casper freight office and talked to the clerk there about the railroad supply contracts and who handled food provisioning for the construction camps in Harwick County. The clerk, a young man who was bored enough to be helpful, gave her 3 names. One of them was Thurgood. The other 2 were outfits in Cheyenne and a smaller operation outside Douglas. She sent letters to all 3 from the Casper post office before she left, laying out exactly what she needed: volume, frequency, quality standards, delivery point, and what she was prepared to pay. She wrote the letters in the post office with a pen borrowed from the counter clerk, standing at the writing ledge against the wall, because she had not brought writing materials from the ranch, and she was not leaving Casper without those letters in the mail. 2 wrote back. Thurgood was one of them. His letter was businesslike, and his prices were fair once he understood the volume she was talking about, and she thought it was probably not a coincidence that his attitude had changed once he realized she was also talking to his competitors. She negotiated the final terms by letter over the following week. Elias read everything before she sent it, not to correct her, but because he knew freight and contracts from years of running the ranch, and twice he caught language that would have disadvantaged them, and they signed an agreement on a Friday that guaranteed weekly delivery of flour, beef, salt, lard, dried goods, and coffee to Blackstone Ranch at fixed prices for 6 months. When the first delivery arrived the following Tuesday, a full freight wagon from Casper that pulled into the ranch yard at midday and required 2 hours to unload into the expanded storage Elias and Cal had built over the previous weekend in the back of the equipment barn. Marin stood in the yard and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched. Dalt came and stood beside her while they watched Cal and 2 other hands carry sacks from the freight wagon. "Supply contract," he said. It wasn't a question. "6 months?" she said. He nodded, slow and deliberate, the way Dalt did everything. Elias's father tried to get a contract like that for the cattle side. Never quite worked out. He watched the sacks coming off the wagon. "Whole county's going to know about this operation inside a month." "I know," Marin said. "That's not a warning," he said. "That's just how it goes out here. News moves with the freight." The second wagon went operational on a Thursday in late April, and it did not go smoothly. Ada's first day out, she had a harness failure half a mile from the camp. Nothing dangerous, but the left trace buckle gave way and they lost an hour sitting on the road while Ada rigged a temporary fix from a length of rope she carried in the wagon bed because she was, as Marin had correctly assessed, a practical woman who planned for things going wrong. The repair held long enough to get to camp and get through service, but Ada came back that afternoon with the buckle in her hand and a specific opinion about the quality of the hardware Elias had purchased. "Where did you get this?" Ada said, setting it on the kitchen table. Elias looked at it. "Harwick. This is the cheap version of this buckle. The good one is 4 cents more and lasts 10 times longer." She set it down. "I need the good one." "I'll get the good one," Elias said without argument. He did. He drove to Harwick the next morning and came back with the correct buckle and also a spare, because the look Ada had given him the previous evening apparently contained a lesson he was taking seriously. Marin, watching this from the kitchen window, felt something she recognized after a moment as gratitude. Not for the buckle, but for the fact that Elias was becoming the kind of man who drove 40 miles round trip because a woman who worked for them needed the right equipment to do her job safely. She wasn't sure if that was the ranch changing him or the circumstances or just what happened when a man's survival was tied to people he'd started to actually see. She didn't try to analyze it too hard. It was just a thing that was happening, and it was good. By the second week, Ada had found her own rhythm on her route. She took the far end of the camp, which required an extra half-mile of road, but reached the men on the late grading sites who couldn't get to Marin's wagon on time. They were the hungriest men, and they were extremely loyal about it, once they knew Ada was coming. Ada ran her service with the specific no-nonsense warmth of a woman who has fed difficult people in difficult conditions for a long time and retains her good humor about it as a matter of principle rather than personality. The men liked her. They tipped better at Ada's wagon than at Marin's, which Marin found mildly amusing and Ada found entirely expected. "Men are easier to manage when you let them believe they're getting away with something," Ada said one evening, eating supper with Marin and Elias after a long day. She had started doing this a few times a week. The drive back to her claim in the dark was not something worth rushing toward. I let them think they're getting a deal. They think they're clever. They come back the next day. You are giving them a deal, Elias said. Your prices are lower than Marin's. By 2 cents, Ada said, and I make it back on volume. She cut her biscuit in half and looked at it. These are still better than mine. Your cornbread is better, Marin said. Everything I make is better than my cornbread. There was an ease at the table that evening that caught Marin somewhere in the middle of it. The three of them talking over the end of a long day like people who had been doing this together for years rather than weeks. She had not expected, when she arrived at this ranch with her 2 trunks and her cast-iron skillet, to find herself sitting at a table with a hired business partner who was becoming a friend and a husband who had become someone she genuinely respected. She had expected to survive. Survival had been the whole plan, but something larger than survival was accumulating around them, quietly, in the particular way that things grow when you're too busy to notice. In the daily numbers in the tin box, in the freight deliveries stacking up the barn, in the debt payments Elias sent to the bank, with a steadiness that was rebuilding his standing in Harwick County 1 month at a time. The ranch hands felt it too. Gus Prater, who remained constitutionally unable to express anything resembling enthusiasm, had nonetheless stopped making comments about the kitchen operation and had started, quietly, doing small maintenance tasks around the wagon setup without being asked, reinforcing the counterboard, checking the wheel hubs before the morning drives. Cal had asked Marin twice now if there was anything she needed him to do on the supply side, which was not a question Cal had ever thought to ask before April. Even the lean cattle in the north pasture seemed, in Marin's unscientific assessment, to be doing better. Elias had put the first real money into supplemental feed in 3 years, and the difference showed in the way they moved. It was a Thursday evening, 6 weeks into the 2-wagon operation, when Marin was cleaning up after supper and Elias came in and sat at the kitchen table without his ledger. He just sat there, which was unusual enough that she turned around to check on him. "Bank sent a letter," he said. She waited. "We're 3 months ahead on the payment schedule." He said it like he was reading it again in his mind to make sure he had the number right. 3 months. They wrote to confirm the payment was not an error. Marin turned fully around and leaned against the dry sink. "They thought it was a mistake," Elias said. "Did you write back?" "Not yet. Write back and tell them it's not a mistake." She paused. "And ask them what the payoff figure is for the full note." Elias looked up. "The full note is a number," she said. "I want to know what the number is." He held her gaze for a moment, and in his face she could see him adjusting to something. The same adjustment she had seen in him on the drive back from the camp after that first morning, when he'd said, "That's more than I've taken in on a good week." The adjustment of a man updating his understanding of what was possible. "All right," he said. "I'll write back tonight." Marin nodded and turned back to the dishes. From outside came the normal sounds of the ranch settling into evening, the hands moving toward the bunkhouse, the horses in the corral, the wind doing its usual commentary on the whole proceedings. She washed the tin cups and thought about numbers. She thought about the Casper wholesaler and the growing camp and the survey crew that was supposed to arrive within the month, and what it would take to build a 3rd wagon. She thought about a conversation she'd had in Harwick that week with a woman named Clara who had 3 grown daughters and needed work, and could cook well enough to hold her own. The ranch was not fixed. There was no version of this where everything was fixed. Something was always cracked or slow or behind or insufficient. That was just the nature of the thing. But for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, the direction of travel was clear. She set the last cup on the shelf and dried her hands and went to find Elias to ask him where he kept the writing paper. The letter from the bank arrived on a Wednesday, and Elias read the payoff figure at the kitchen table with the expression of a man who had been quoted the price of something he'd given up believing he could ever afford. He set the letter down. He picked it up again. He set it down again. "Say it out loud," Marin said. $4,260. He said it slowly, the way you say a number when you're still not sure you read it right. "That's the full note, including the remaining interest." Marin was at the range. She did not stop what she was doing. "How much do we have set aside right now?" Counting last week's receipts. "A little over 900. She nodded. "By fall," she said. "If the survey crew comes in as expected and we add the 3rd wagon, by September we could be there." Elias folded the letter and held it in both hands. Marin, that's a debt my father built, and I've been carrying for 11 years. I know. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying about September. I'm just saying what that number means. She turned around and looked at him. He was staring at the folded letter, not at her, and there was something in his face that was private and a little painful, the way things are when you've lived with a weight long enough that the prospect of setting it down feels disorienting rather than simply good. She understood that. She didn't try to rush him through it. Write back and tell them you'll have it cleared by October at the latest, she said. That's a conservative estimate. Give yourself room. He nodded, slow. October, he said, like he was fixing the word somewhere specific in his mind. She turned back to the range. That had been the first week of May. By the middle of the month, the survey crew from the east had arrived. 63 men, as Briggs had predicted, folded into the existing camp and immediately unhappy about the food situation because Fawcett's operation, which had barely been adequate for the original crew, was visibly buckling under the extra load. Within 2 days of their arrival, Marin had 15 new regulars at her wagon who had been tipped off by the existing men, and Ada had 12 at hers. The third wagon, an arrangement Marin had been quietly building toward for 3 weeks, went operational the first week of June. The driver was a man named Obi, one of Elias's older hands who had worked the ranch for 9 years, and whose back had gotten bad enough that the heavy cattle work was becoming a problem for him. He was 61, deliberate in everything he did, and he could cook well enough to manage a service line if Marin handled all the morning prep. She handled all the morning prep. She had been getting up at 3:30 anyway. Getting up at 3 did not seem like a significant sacrifice. 3 wagons. By mid-June, they were serving close to 250 men a day across all 3 service windows. The tin box had become 2 tin boxes. The Casper wholesaler had doubled their delivery frequency without being asked, which told Marin he was paying attention to how much they were ordering. It was by any reasonable measure working. It was working well enough that people outside the camp and the ranch had started noticing. The Harwick County Gazette ran a small item about the Blackstone Ranch operation in its June issue, 4 sentences tucked between a notice about a lost mule and an advertisement for a dentist in Casper. But 4 sentences in the Gazette reached everyone in the county who could read, and several who couldn't but had it read to them. Marin read the item at the kitchen table and felt the particular unease of something that had been private becoming public. She couldn't have explained why it unsettled her. It was favorable. It was accurate, but it had the effect of making the operation feel exposed in a way it hadn't before. She mentioned this to Elias that evening. "You knew it would get out," he said. "Dalt told you that in April." "I know. It's not that I didn't know. It just feels different now that it's happened." He considered this. "Is there something specific you're worried about?" She thought about it honestly. "Competition," she said. "Someone sees that item and decides they want a piece of the same camp. That's a fair concern. Or someone sees it and decides they don't like what we're doing, for reasons that have nothing to do with food." Elias was quiet in a way that meant he understood exactly what she was referring to without either of them having to name it. The railroad company, not the construction crew, not the surveyors, but the company itself, the office in Cheyenne that managed contracts and operations, had a vested interest in how its workers were provisioned. It had not, to anyone's knowledge, objected to Marin's wagons, but it had also not been asked. "Has anyone from the railroad company contacted us?" she asked. "Not yet." "Not yet," she repeated. "Sorte." The man from the railroad company arrived on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of June. He came in a private buggy, well-maintained, good horses, the kind of rig that belongs to someone whose expenses are paid by an organization rather than out of their own pocket. He pulled into the ranch yard around 10, which was late enough that Marin was already back from the morning service at the camp and was in the kitchen starting prep for the next day. Elias was out at the north pasture, which had been giving trouble again. One of the supplemental feed deliveries had come up short, and the cattle in the north section were showing it. Marin heard the buggy come in. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front of the house. The man climbing down from the buggy was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the frontier in a way that meant he'd put thought into it. Dark coat, good boots, a hat that hadn't been slept in. He had a broad face and the easy posture of someone accustomed to being received with attention, and he looked at the ranch house, then at the wagon set up visible beside the equipment barn, with the measuring eye of a man who is cataloging what he sees. He turned and saw Marin and said, "Mrs. Rowan? That's right." Victor Holden. He offered his hand, which she shook. His grip was firm without being aggressive, a practiced handshake. "I'm Regional Operations Director for the Continental Western Railroad Company. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." "My husband is out on the property," she said. "He'll be back within the hour." "I'm happy to wait, but I'd be pleased to speak with you as well, if you're willing. My understanding is that you run the operation." She looked at him for a moment. He said it without edge, not a compliment exactly, just a statement of what he'd been told. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." She put coffee on because that was what you did and because it gave her something to do with her hands while she listened to him, which was the most useful thing she could do in the next few minutes. Holden sat at the kitchen table and declined the coffee when it was offered, and instead placed a leather folder on the table and opened it to a single sheet of paper. "I'll be direct with you," he said. "Continental Western has been aware of your food service operation for approximately 6 weeks. We've had no reason to object to it, and frankly, our workers have been," he paused, choosing a word, "significantly more productive since your wagons started running. Better fed men work better. That's not a complicated equation." "I'd agree with that," Marin said. "What I'm here to discuss is the company's interest in formalizing that arrangement." He turned the paper around on the table so she could see it. It was a purchase offer, a single paragraph, a number, a signature line. "We'd like to buy the operation, the wagons, the supply contracts, the staffing arrangements, the routes. Everything as it currently stands, and we'd like to offer you and your husband a very fair price for it." Marin looked at the number on the paper. She did not pick it up. She did not reach for it. She looked at it from where she sat, and the number was, she had to be honest, not a small number. It was not the number of someone who had done no homework. Holden had come here knowing what the operation was worth, or near enough. "This would include the supply contract with the Casper wholesaler," she said. "We would assume all existing contracts." "And Ada Marsh, the woman who runs the second wagon?" Holden blinked, a small hesitation. "We would negotiate terms with any existing staff. She's not staff. She's an independent contractor with her own agreement with us." Marin kept her voice even. "She would need to be made whole. Whatever arrangement you make with her would need to be fair." "Of course." He recovered smoothly. Continental Western would deal fairly with all involved parties. Marin picked up her own coffee and held it. She looked at the paper again. Then she looked at Holden. "I appreciate you coming out personally," she said. "I need to speak with my husband before I can give you any kind of answer." "Naturally." He closed the folder. "I'll be in Harwick through Wednesday. I'd hope to hear something before then." "You'll hear something before then," she said. Elias came in from the north pasture a little after 11, dirty and irritated about the feed situation, and found Marin sitting at the kitchen table with the purchase offer in front of her. She pushed it across the table without preamble. He read it again. He sat down. "Holden," he said, "Continental Western's regional director." He drove out himself. Elias set the paper down flat on the table and put his hand on top of it, as if it might move. "This is real money." "It is. This is more than the banknote." "I know." He looked at her. "You don't want to do it." It wasn't a question quite, but it needed an answer. "I want to understand what we're actually deciding," she said. "If we sell, we have the money to pay off the ranch completely and have some left over. We go back to being a cattle operation. The bank pressure goes away. But the operation is worth more than this number in 6 months. In a year, it's worth considerably more." She put her finger on the offer without touching it. "He came here now, Elias, not in October. Now. That's not coincidence." Elias was quiet, working through it. "He knows the survey camp is temporary," Marin said. "The main crew moves west in the fall, following the grade. When they go, this number goes with them. The operation's value drops significantly if it's serving a depleted camp. So he came now while the number is still high enough to look generous." "That's..." Elias stopped. "That's a good read. He's not a dishonest man necessarily. He's a railroad man. He's doing what railroad men do. He's trying to buy something useful at the best price he can get." She picked up her coffee. "But we don't have to sell." No, Elias said. We don't. He thought for a moment. What's the alternative? The crew moves west. We move with it. We've already proven we can run mobile. That's the whole point of the wagon setup. Where the camp goes, we go. That means leaving the ranch for long stretches. You could manage the ranch. I go with the wagons. Elias looked at her steadily. That's not what I want. She wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that. Whether he meant he didn't want the ranch without her there, or he didn't want her gone and alone with a crew somewhere on the frontier, or both. She didn't ask him to clarify, because clarifying it would require a conversation they hadn't had yet, and she wasn't sure they were ready for it. Then we figure out a different way to structure it, she said. We hire people who can run the wagons without us driving every route ourselves. Clara, he said, naming the woman Marin had mentioned in April. Clara and possibly one or two more. Ada would stay on as lead, I'd stay on as operations. You manage the cattle side, we grow both. Elias picked up the offer and read the number one more time. She could see him weighing it, the certainty of it against the uncertainty of everything she was describing. The relief of the banknote paid in full today, now, against the larger shape of what they'd built and what it might become if they kept building. Right back to Halden, he said finally. Tell him we're not interested in selling the full operation. Marin let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. But, Elias held up a hand, tell him we'd consider a limited supply contract. If Continental Western wants to guarantee volume by committing to a contract, we'd negotiate terms. That keeps them as a customer without giving them ownership. He won't like that. Probably not. He came here expecting to buy something. I know what he came here expecting. Elias folded the offer in half and set it aside. Write the letter. What? Halden's response came Friday, delivered by a rider from Harwick rather than through the post, which told Marin something about how urgently he was operating. The letter was polite on the surface and not polite underneath, the language of a man who was accustomed to getting what he came for. He declined the supply contract proposal. He reiterated the purchase offer. He noted, in a paragraph that read carefully neutral but was not, that Continental Western had significant relationships with the freight and supply networks in the region, and that independent operators sometimes found those networks difficult to navigate when not working cooperatively with the railroad's interests. Marin read the paragraph 3 times. She brought the letter to Ada that evening. Ada read it at the kitchen table, set it down, and said, "He's telling you he can cut off your supplies." That's what I read. Can he? Thurgood and Casper is independent, but the freight lines that bring Thurgood's goods to him. Marin stopped. Thurgood ships on Continental Western freight lines. Almost everything in this part of Wyoming does. Ada was quiet. And the camp, Marin continued. Continental Western can tell the camp foreman not to allow our wagons on the site. They own the camp. They own the right of way. We've been operating on goodwill and the fact that nobody above the foreman level had formally objected. Until now, Ada said. Until now. Ada turned her coffee cup in her hands. So he's not asking anymore, he's telling. He's telling in the language of asking, Marin said. Which is worse in some ways because it leaves us the option of misunderstanding him and then being surprised later when the supplies stop coming. What does Elias say? He's angry. She said it plainly. He doesn't like being handled. Neither do I. Ada looked at her. But, Marin pressed her palms flat on the table, but being angry doesn't solve the problem. She had been thinking since the letter arrived, turning the shape of it over and over, looking for the edges of it. Halden holds one piece, the freight network, the ability to make our supply chain difficult, and the camp access, the ability to lock us out of our primary customers. She paused. But he doesn't hold every piece. What piece doesn't he hold? Marin looked at her. The other railroad. Ada stared at her. The Pacific Meridian Line, the one laying grade from the north. They're competing for the same territory as Continental Western. They have their own construction camps, 4 of them that I know of, all running north of here. Their own workers who are eating the same bad food from the same kind of camp cook. Marin's voice stayed level, but there was something moving underneath it, something that had been building since she first read Halden's careful neutral language that was not neutral. If Halden cuts us out of the Continental Western camp, we don't fight him for it. We take everything we've built, and we offer it to his competitor. What bites? The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's a gamble, Ada said. It's a large gamble, Marin agreed. Pacific Meridian might say no. They might. And even if they say yes, moving the operation north means new roads, new logistics, everything reconfigured. I know. And if Halden finds out you're in talks with them before you have an agreement, he'll move immediately instead of giving us time to respond. Marin looked at Ada directly. I know all of that. I've been sitting with all of that since this letter came in this afternoon. Ada studied her for a long moment. You're going to do it anyway. I haven't decided. You've decided. You just haven't said it out loud yet. Marin looked at the letter on the table. She thought about the banknote. She thought about 3 wagons and the morning drives down the draw road and $23.40 in a tin box on the very first day, and Elias saying, that's more than I've taken in on a good week. She thought about all the months between that morning and this evening, every early start and burned batch and cracked board and rough mile of road, all of it accumulated into something real. She was not going to hand it to Victor Halden for a number that was generous now and meaningless in a year. Get me a piece of paper, she said. Ada got up without another word and found the writing paper on the shelf where Elias kept it and set it on the table with the pen beside it and sat back down across from Marin with her coffee. Marin pulled the paper toward her. She wrote the letter to Pacific Meridian that night, sitting at the kitchen table while Ada drank her coffee and the wind pressed against the house and the ranch settled into the dark around them. She wrote it carefully, not desperately, not aggressively, but with the precise clarity of someone who knows exactly what they have to offer and exactly what they need in return. She laid out the operation, the wagons, the supply network, the staff, the volume, the model. She wrote the price per plate and the daily receipts and the size of the customer base. She wrote the terms she wanted: exclusive contract, defined routes, guaranteed access, fair payment on delivery. She wrote it twice. The first draft had a sentence in it that sounded like she was asking for something. She crossed it out and rewrote it to sound like what it was: a proposal from someone with a proven operation, offering a tested solution to a known problem. When she was finished, she folded it, addressed it to the Pacific Meridian Railroad Company, Operations Division, Cheyenne, and set it in the center of the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she stood up, cleaned the coffee cups, and went to find Elias. He was in the main room with his own letter, a response to Halden that he'd been drafting, she assumed. He looked up when she came in. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it before you send whatever you're writing. He set the pen down. He turned in his chair to face her fully. She stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, with the lamp behind her and the dark outside the window, and she told him everything she'd been thinking since the letter arrived. The Pacific Meridian idea, the gamble in it, the timeline, the fact that Halden might move against them before they had an answer. Elias listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on without realizing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You already wrote the letter, he said. It's on the kitchen table. He got up, went to the kitchen, and read it. She followed and stood near the range while he read it twice, the way he read everything important. He set it down. He didn't say anything immediately. She could see him working through the risk the same way she had, picking it up, examining it, looking for where it fell apart. If Pacific Meridian says no, he said, and Halden's already moved against us, we're significantly worse off than we are right now. Possibly back to where we were in February. Possibly. She didn't soften it. He looked at the letter again. This is a good letter, he said. I know. It's the right letter to write. He straightened up. But we're going to be waiting on an answer from a railroad company in Cheyenne, and we don't know how long that takes or if it comes at all. And in the meantime, Halden is sitting in Harwick waiting for our response. I know. So we stall him. We write back politely and tell him we need additional time to review the offer with our legal arrangements. She had already thought about this. He'll give us a week, maybe 2. He needs to look reasonable. Elias nodded slowly. And we send this tonight? First rider to Harwick tomorrow morning, Harwick to Casper on the stage to Cheyenne. She calculated. Letters there in 4 days, response, if they're interested, back in another 4 to 6. That's close. It's close, she agreed. He picked up the letter to Pacific Meridian, folded it carefully, and handed it back to her. "Send it," he said. The letter to Halden went out Tuesday morning, carried to Harwick by Cal on his regular supply run. It was polite and non-committal. Marin had written it in 20 minutes the night before, carefully choosing language that implied ongoing deliberation without promising anything. She told him they were reviewing the offer in light of their existing contractual obligations and would respond formally within 2 weeks. She thanked him for his patience and his directness. It was the kind of letter that bought time without burning anything down. She hated writing it, but she wrote it well. The letter to Pacific Meridian went out on the same morning by the same rider, addressed separately, tucked inside Cal's saddlebag beneath the Casper supply order. Cal didn't ask what was in it. She hadn't asked him to not ask. He simply had the instinct not to. Then they waited. Waiting was harder than working, which was why Marin filled every hour of it with work. The Casper wholesaler had flagged a coming shortage in salt pork, something about a supplier problem further east, and she spent a Tuesday afternoon writing to 3 alternative suppliers she'd identified through the Harwick freight office, laying out specifications and asking for quotes. The North Pasture fence was finally getting its full replacement, which Elias was running himself with Dalt and 2 of the younger hands, and on Wednesday evening she brought supper out to them on the north line rather than making them come in, because they were losing light and the work needed finishing. She set up on the tailgate of the small wagon and served 4 men standing in a half-built pasture as the sun dropped behind the western hills, and nobody said much. But Dalt looked at the spread she'd brought and said, "You didn't have to do this." And she said, "I know." And that was the whole conversation. Ada noticed the tension in Marin without being told there was tension. She came by Thursday afternoon on the excuse of borrowing a particular spice blend they'd been experimenting with, and stayed for 2 hours helping prep the next morning's biscuit run. They worked mostly in silence, which was one of the things Marin had come to value about Ada. She did not require the space between them to be filled. "You'll hear back," Ada said once, near the end of the afternoon. "I might hear back that they're not interested," Marin said. "You might. And then we'll figure out something else." Ada rolled the biscuit dough with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times. "What else would you figure out?" "I haven't gotten that far." She was honest about it. "I've been trying not to borrow trouble in advance." "That's probably smart," Ada said. "You've always been better at that than me. I borrow trouble constantly. I've been borrowing trouble since last Tuesday." "You don't show it." "I show it to my horses. They're discreet." Marin laughed. A real one. Sudden, which surprised her. Ada glanced at her with the small, satisfied expression of a woman who had aimed for exactly that result. But Halden moved on the 8th day. Not with a letter this time. With action. Marin found out from Briggs, who came to the ranch yard on a Thursday morning looking uncomfortable. The look of a man delivering news he didn't generate and doesn't enjoy carrying. He turned his hat in his hands and told her that the camp foreman, a man named Rourke, who had always been straightforward with her, had received a directive from Continental Western's operations office. Effective immediately. Outside food vendors were prohibited from operating on or adjacent to any Continental Western construction site in Harwick County. Marin stood in the yard and looked at Briggs. "Effective immediately," she repeated. "That's what the directive says. Rourke showed it to me himself. He's not happy about it." Briggs turned his hat again. "He said to tell you he had no choice." "I understand," she said. "Tell him I understand." After Briggs left, she stood in the yard for a moment alone, before going inside. The morning was clear and warm, the kind of Wyoming summer day that made you forget, briefly, that the state was largely indifferent to human survival. She looked at the 3 wagons parked beside the equipment barn. She looked at the road south that led down to the draw and the camp they had been serving for 4 months. Then she went inside and found Elias. He was in the main room reading a report from the livestock buyer in Casper. They had been building toward a cattle sale in August. And he looked up when she came in. Something in her face told him before she said anything. She told him what Briggs had said. He set the report down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "The letter's been in Cheyenne for 6 days." "I know." If Pacific Meridian was going to respond quickly, we'd have heard. Not necessarily. A company that size, the letter goes to an office, sits on someone's desk, gets passed to someone with authority. She stopped herself. "I don't know their internal process. I don't know how long it takes. But Halden knows we sent it, Elias said. The sentence landed in the room like something dropped. Marin looked at him. How would he know? Harwick is a small town, Marin. Cal carried 2 letters out that morning, one to Halden, one on the stage to Cheyenne. The stage clerk knows what goes to Cheyenne. Halden has eyes in that town, probably always has. He wasn't accusatory, he was just putting the pieces on the table. He moved faster than 2 weeks because he found out about the Pacific Meridian letter. She sat down. She had been through every version of the risk in her mind before she sent that letter, and she had accounted for most of them. She had not fully accounted for this one. Not that Halden would find out. She'd known that was possible, but that he would move this quickly, this cleanly, cutting the legs out before she even had an answer. All right, she said, the camp is closed to us. What do we still have? 3 wagons, Elias said. Supply contract with Thurgood and Casper, which, he paused, Thurgood ships on continental western freight. If Halden presses that, the supply contract becomes difficult. Has he pressed it? Not yet. As of this morning. Then we still have supplies. She thought. Ada and Obi are owed this week's earnings regardless. We pay them. Obviously. And Clara, she's been doing morning prep 3 days a week. She gets paid. I know. Elias looked at the window. The cattle sale in August is still on track. Even without the food operation, the August sale covers the September bank payment. We don't lose the ranch over this. No, Marin said, but we lose what we've built, and the people depending on it lose their income. She pressed her palm flat on the table, a habit she'd developed without noticing, something to anchor herself when her thinking got loud. How much do we have set aside right now? Exactly. Counting everything. $2,200. $2,200, more than they'd had in years. Not enough to pay off the full note, not the $4,260 Harwick had quoted, but more than half of it. All of it built in 4 months by 3 wagons and a dozen people getting up before dawn to feed strangers in a railroad camp. I'm not selling to Halden, she said. It came out flat and final, not emotional, just true. I didn't think you were. Even if Pacific Meridian doesn't respond. Elias looked at her with the steady attention he'd given her since that first evening in the kitchen when she'd asked him about the railroad camp, and he'd said, "What are you thinking?" He had the look of a man who had been updating his understanding of her for 4 months and was still finding things to update. "What are you thinking?" he said, which was exactly what he'd said that first night, and neither of them acknowledged the echo of it, but it was there. "I'm thinking," she said, "that we have 3 wagons, a supply contract that's intact for now, and a list of every construction camp in a 100-mile radius that is not owned by Continental Western." She looked at him. Pacific Meridian has 4 camps north of here, but there are also 2 independent mining operations past Owl Creek and the new county road project that's been running crews out of the Douglas office all spring. Those are smaller operations. They're operations that need feeding. The roads north are worse than the draw. I know. Some of those sites are 12, 15 miles out. I know, Elias. She was not impatient with him. He was not making objections. He was mapping the terrain, which was what she needed him to do. Is it possible? He thought about it seriously. The wagons can handle it if we check the rigs carefully before each run. The supply side is the harder problem. More distance means more fuel, more travel time. The food has to stay hot longer. We'd need to modify the insulation on the carry boxes. Dalt could do that. Dalt could probably do that. He thought more. Obi's the best driver we have for rough road. Ada knows the North Country better than any of us. She ranched up there for 8 years. I know. He was quiet for a moment. This doesn't solve the Halden problem. It routes around it. Routing around it is enough for now. She met his eyes. We keep the operation running. We keep the people paid. And we wait for Cheyenne. The telegram arrived 9 days later. It came to the Harwick Telegraph office on a Wednesday afternoon, addressed to Mrs. M. Rowan, Blackstone Ranch, and the telegraph clerk sent his boy out with it on horseback because the clerk was a man named Peterson who had been watching the Blackstone Ranch situation with the engaged interest of a Harwick County resident who understood that what happened at that ranch was now, whether anyone had planned it that way or not, something that mattered to the wider community. Marin was in the equipment barn with Dalt, working on the insulation modifications for the carry boxes when she heard the horse come into the yard. She came out and took the telegram from the boy, read it standing in the yard with Dalt behind her, and stood very still for a moment. She read it a second time. Then she turned around and said, "Dalt, go get Elias." The telegram was from a woman named Lenora Ashby, Director of Logistics and Field Operations, Pacific Meridian Railroad Company. It was 11 lines, efficiently written, no language wasted. Pacific Meridian had reviewed the proposal with interest. They were prepared to discuss a formal contract arrangement. They would send a representative to Blackstone Ranch the following Monday. They asked for confirmation of receipt and of the meeting. The last line said, "Your operational model is precisely what we have been looking for. Miss Ashby." Marin read that last line 3 times. Elias arrived at a half run from the direction of the north pasture, Dalt 2 steps behind him. Marin handed him the telegram without speaking. He read it, and she watched his face while he did. The careful neutral expression he maintained while processing, and then the small, involuntary change in it when he reached the last line. He looked up at her. "Monday," he said. 4 days. He handed the telegram back. His hand was not entirely steady. "We should—" he started and then stopped and started again. "We should make sure the ranch is presentable." "The ranch is fine," she said. "The north fence boards from this week are still stacked by the—" "Elias." She put her hand on his arm, brief and firm, the way you stop a man who is about to do something unnecessary because he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. "The ranch is fine. She's coming to talk business, not to inspect the fencing." He nodded. He looked at the telegram in her hand. 4 days, he said again, more quietly. 4 days, she agreed. Lenora Ashby arrived on Monday at noon. She came with a driver and a second person, a young man with a ledger under his arm who turned out to be her assistant, in a well-maintained freight wagon that was notably more practical than Halden's private buggy. She was perhaps 40, angular and composed, with dark hair pulled back and the direct gaze of someone who had spent years in rooms where people underestimated her and had long since stopped being interested in correcting that mistake until the moment it mattered. She shook Elias's hand first, then Marin's, and said, "Thank you for seeing me. I know the timing has been difficult." "Come inside," Marin said. They sat at the kitchen table, Marin, Elias, and Lenora Ashby, while the assistant settled on the bench near the door with his ledger and his pen. Marin had made coffee, and there was food on the table, because there was always food on the table in this kitchen, and Lenora Ashby took the coffee and looked at the biscuits and took one and ate half of it before she'd even opened her folder. "These are very good," she said. "Thank you." "I'll confess I had someone in Harwick describe your operation to me before I came," Lenora said, not apologetically, just factually. "I wanted context beyond your letter. Your letter was excellent, by the way. Clear, direct, no wasted language. I read a lot of proposals. Most of them spend 3 pages saying what you said in 1. "I didn't have time to be lengthy," Marin said. "Nobody ever does." Lenora opened her folder. "I'm going to be straightforward with you about what Pacific Meridian needs, and then I'd like you to tell me where that aligns with what you've built. We have 4 active construction camps north and northwest of here, as I assume you know. We have a 5th breaking ground in September, possibly a 6th by November if the surveying runs as we expect. The food provisioning at all of these camps is," she paused, "inadequate. The men are fed. They don't quit over it. But inadequate provisioning costs us in productivity, in morale, in the small daily friction that adds up over a 6-month build. I've been making the case internally for a contracted external provisioning arrangement for over a year." "What stopped it before?" Elias asked. Lenora looked at him. "The assumption that no independent operator could handle the volume and the logistics. The camps are spread over a large area. The roads are difficult. Turnover among small operators is high." She looked back at Marin. "Your letter described an operation that has handled volume and difficult logistics for 4 months without interruption. That changed the internal conversation significantly." "We were interrupted," Marin said. "Continental Western shut us out of their camp 10 days ago." "I know." Lenora's expression didn't change. "Victor Halden contacted our operations office in Cheyenne the day after he shut you out. He suggested that Continental Western and Pacific Meridian might reach a mutual agreement regarding independent food operators in the region. the implication being that Pacific Meridian should also decline to work with you. The kitchen was very quiet. What was Pacific Meridian's response? Elias said. Our president told him we appreciated the suggestion and would take it under advisement. A small pause. We did not take it under advisement. We sent me instead. She looked at Marin steadily. I want you to understand what you're dealing with before we discuss terms. Halden is not going to stop. If we sign a contract, he will create whatever friction he can. Supply chain interference, access disputes, anything within the range of what's legally defensible. You should expect that. I expected it before you said it, Marin said. Good. Lenora picked up the second half of her biscuit. Then let's talk about the contract. Boy, they talked for 3 hours. It was not a simple conversation. Lenora Ashby was precise and thorough and had clearly prepared for every variable, which meant the negotiation moved quickly in some places and slowly in others. And there were 2 moments where Marin and Elias exchanged a look across the table that meant we need a minute, and Lenora gave them one without being asked. The contract Pacific Meridian was offering was an exclusive provisioning arrangement, all 4 current camps, extending to the 5th and 6th when they opened, at a fixed rate per man per meal, paid weekly in advance. The rate was fair. More than fair, actually. Marin had come into the meeting with a minimum number in her head, and the rate Lenora put on the table was above it. The terms required expanding the operation. More wagons, more staff, a more systematic supply chain, a logistics structure that could be managed partly in absentia. This was the part that required the most negotiation, not on price, but on timeline and responsibility. We need full operational capacity at the first 2 camps within 30 days, Lenora said at one point. 60, Marin said. 30 is not realistic for the supply chain restructuring. 45. 50, and you give us access to Pacific Meridian's freight network for supply shipments. Not at subsidized rates, fair market rates. I just need the access guaranteed so Halden can't pressure our suppliers through continental western lines. Lenora looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something in her folder. Agreed, she said. Elias, beside Marin, shifted slightly in his chair. A small movement she recognized as his version of the feeling she had when something important clicked into place. There were other terms. The contract required Pacific Meridian to have audit rights on food quality, a provision Marin had no objection to. It required a named representative on Marin's side with authority to make operational decisions, which Marin named as herself with Ada Marsh as secondary. It required a communication structure, weekly reports, a designated Pacific Meridian contact, and Lenora named herself as that contact, which Marin thought was telling. A logistics director who named herself the direct contact was a logistics director who intended to be involved. When they had worked through the main structure, Lenora's assistant compiled everything in neat columns and read it back. Marin listened to every word. Elias was making notes on a separate sheet of paper, the cramped, precise handwriting she'd come to know well. There's one more thing, Marin said when the reading was done. Lenora waited. Ada Marsh. She runs the second wagon and she's been with me since the beginning. She takes the same terms I take. Percentage of her routes receipts, same rate, same protections under the contract. That's not unusual. I want it written in specifically, not implied. Written. Lenora looked at her for a moment with an expression that might have been assessment and might have been something closer to recognition. Written in, she said. Done. They signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon, not the final contract, which would be drawn up properly by Pacific Meridian's legal office in Cheyenne and returned for signatures within 2 weeks, but a letter of intent signed by Lenora Ashby on behalf of Pacific Meridian Railroad Company and by Marin and Elias Rowan on behalf of Blackstone Ranch Operations, that committed both parties to the terms they'd discussed. Marin signed her name at the bottom of the letter of intent, and her hand was steady. Lenora Ashby and her assistant stayed for supper, because by the time the paperwork was done, the day had run long and Marin had food ready, and it seemed pointless for anyone to drive anywhere hungry. Ada came over. Marin had sent Obi to fetch her mid-afternoon, when it became clear the conversation was going well, and the 5 of them sat around the kitchen table in the early evening with plates of beef and cornbread and the last of a dried apple pie that Cal had claimed a piece of 3 times already and been redirected each time. Lenora and Ada fell into a conversation about road conditions north of the ranch, with the focused intensity of two people who had been waiting a long time to talk to someone who understood the specific problems they were each dealing with. Marin listened with half her attention while she ate and watched Elias, who was at the far end of the table talking to Lenore's assistant about the cattle operation, with the ease of a man who had found, gradually, over the course of a summer, that he had things worth talking about. He looked different than he had in March. Not dramatically different, he was still the same quiet, precise man who'd handed her down from a freight wagon and shown her a room with a west-facing window. But the particular exhausted tightness that had been in his face the first night, the look of a man who was running out of road, was gone. In its place was something she recognized as a kind of settled confidence. Not certainty, nothing as simple as that, but the particular quality of a person who has been tested by something real and found that they held. She thought he had always had it. She thought the 3 years of drought and debt and grinding survival had just buried it under enough weight that it couldn't show. After supper, while the others were still at the table, Marin stepped out the back door onto the small porch that faced east. The evening was cooling fast, the way Wyoming evenings did even in summer, and the sky was doing something complicated with orange and purple over the eastern hills. She stood there with her hands in her apron pockets and thought about 30 days ago, when she'd been sitting at this same table reading Halden's carefully neutral letter and feeling the walls close in. She heard the door behind her and turned. Elias came out and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. He looked at the same sky. "Dalt's going to need help with the wagon expansion," he said. "Building out the 4th and 5th rigs. That's going to take people." "I know. I was thinking about the Casper carpenter who did the stove fitting. He did good work." "He did." Elias was quiet for a moment. "The September cattle sale combined with the contract advance. We can pay off the note by November, ahead of what I told the bank." "I know. 11 years, he said. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. He turned and looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her in February, the polite, careful regard of two strangers, but the way you look at someone you have stood next to in difficult weather and found to still be there. "You knew," he said. "When you wrote that letter to Pacific Meridian, you knew it might not work." "I knew it might not work," she agreed, "and you sent it anyway." "We sent it," she said. "You said send it." He was quiet. "I said send it because you'd already decided to. I was following your lead." "You were making a decision with me. That's different from following." She looked at him directly. "Elias, we made this together. The whole thing. Don't take yourself out of it." He held her gaze for a moment, and in the complicated evening light she could see him sitting with that, accepting it, working it into the version of events he was building for himself. He had spent years alone in the difficulty of this ranch, and she understood that being alone in something for long enough makes it hard to believe, even when the evidence is right there, that you have genuinely stopped being alone. "All right," he said quietly. From inside came the sound of conversation and Ada laughing at something, and the particular warmth of a house full of people at the end of a day that had mattered. Marin looked back at the eastern sky, now going deep blue at the top, still orange at the horizon. Somewhere north of them, 4 railroad camps full of hungry men were about to get considerably better food, and somewhere in Cheyenne, a legal office was drafting a contract, and somewhere in Harwick, Victor Halden was sitting with whatever it felt like to have miscalculated. She didn't spend much time on that last part. She had too much to plan. The final contract from Pacific Meridian arrived 14 days after Lenora Ashby drove out of the ranch yard, delivered by a Casper courier who had been paid extra to ride direct rather than wait on the stage schedule. It was 11 pages, dense with legal language that Elias read twice and Marin read 3 times. And there was one clause in the indemnification section that neither of them liked, a provision that would have allowed Pacific Meridian to terminate without penalty if operational capacity fell below 80% for 2 consecutive weeks. Marin wrote back the same day requesting the threshold be reduced to 60% with a 30-day cure period, on the grounds that frontier operations were subject to weather and road conditions beyond any contractor's control. Lenora responded within 4 days. Agreed, with a small modification to the cure period language that Marin accepted because it was reasonable. They signed the final contract on a Thursday morning in late July, Marin and Elias both. At the kitchen table with the window open and a warm wind coming through from the south, Elias pressed the ranch seal into the wax at the bottom of the last page. A simple thing, a stamp his father had made years ago with the Blackstone brand. And Marin watched his hands while he did it and thought about everything those hands had done in the months since she arrived. Fixed axles and fence posts and wagon boards. Driven rough roads before dawn. Reached across a table to hand her a letter and say, "Send it." She folded the contract, sealed it, and handed it to the courier. Then she went back to work, because there was a great deal of work to be done. The expansion ran 53 days, which was 3 days over the timeline she'd negotiated with Lenora, and Marin was not happy about the 3 days, but she was practical about it. The fourth wagon had a frame problem discovered midway through construction, a load-bearing board that the Casper carpenter had sourced from a batch of improperly dried timber, which Dalt caught before it became a road failure rather than a workshop problem, which was the best possible version of that discovery. Replacing it cost 4 days. They made back 1 day by running a 2-shift prep schedule through the final week, Marin on mornings and Clara running evenings, and the wagon rolled out on a Tuesday rather than a Saturday. The fifth wagon went smoother. By that point, Dalt had the construction process so thoroughly understood that he was directing most of it himself, with the Casper carpenter executing rather than designing. And Dalt had opinions about timber sourcing that he expressed with the quiet certainty of a man who had been right about practical things for 30 years. The fifth wagon was solid in a way the fourth had taken longer to become. Clara ran the fourth wagon. She had started in May doing morning prep and had shown, over 2 months, a competence and steadiness that Marin had come to rely on the way you rely on something only after it's proven itself in a difficult moment. The difficult moment for Clara had been a July morning when the road to the 3rd Pacific Meridian camp, a rough cutoff through creek bottom that turned treacherous after 2 days of rain, had stopped Obi's wagon half a mile short of camp with a wheel buried in mud to the hub. Clara had been behind him in the fourth wagon, new to the route, and she'd managed the situation herself. Unhitched her team, rigged a pull line with rope from the wagon bed, and got Obi's wheel free before either of them had missed their service window by more than 20 minutes. When Marin heard about it from Obi that evening, she found Clara in the prep kitchen and said simply, "Good work this morning." Clara, who was elbow-deep in cornbread batter and did not look up, said, "The rope was Obi's idea. He told me it was yours." A pause. "We figured it out together." "That's the best version of that story," Marin said. "Remember it that way." The news about Victor Halden came from Lenora in a letter in September. It was not the main subject of the letter. The main subject was a scheduling adjustment for the 5th camp's opening, which had been pushed 3 weeks by a surveying dispute. But it was in the second paragraph stated plainly. Continental Western's board had removed Halden from his regional director position following an internal review of the company's progress in Harwick County. The Western rail grade that Continental Western had been pushing had fallen significantly behind schedule over the summer, and the board had concluded that the operational leadership in the region had been insufficiently focused on primary objectives. Marin read the paragraph, noted it, and moved on to the scheduling information in the 3rd paragraph, because the scheduling information was what she needed to act on. Elias read the letter after her and stopped at the same paragraph. "Halden's out," he said. "I saw." He waited, as if he expected her to say more. She was at the range, adjusting the damper. She didn't say more because there wasn't much to say. She had not spent a significant amount of the summer thinking about Victor Halden. She had thought about wagon frames and supply contracts and road conditions, and the particular problem of keeping food at the right temperature over 12 miles of rough track in September cold. And those were the things that had needed her attention. Halden had been a problem that resolved itself while she was busy with things that mattered more. "Does it feel like something?" Elias asked. "Knowing he's gone?" She thought about it honestly. "It feels like information," she said, "like when the weather changes. You note it and adjust." He was quiet for a moment. "You're harder than you look," he said. She glanced back at him. "I'm not hard. I just don't carry things I've already put down." The bank payment went out in October as promised. Not the monthly payment, the full note. $4,260 in a bank draft drawn on the Harwick County Bank, sent to the lending institution with a cover letter that Elias wrote himself. Marin read the letter before he sealed it. It was short, 4 sentences, professional, with no emotion visible in the language. The last sentence said that the Rowan family appreciated the bank's patience over the years and considered the obligation satisfied in full. She handed it back to him. "It's good. It's just a letter. It's still good." He sealed it, and Cal wrote it to Harwick that afternoon, and that was 11 years of debt discharged on a Tuesday in October with a bank draft and 4 sentences. That evening, without planning it as a celebration, it became one anyway. Ada came by, and Dalt was there, and Clara, and Obie, and the rest of the hands drifted in from the bunkhouse when the word passed around. And Marin made supper for 14 people on a Tuesday night with no particular ceremony, just food and the kind of noise a full kitchen table makes when the people around it have earned the right to be loud. Gus Prater, who had been at Blackstone Ranch longer than almost anyone, and had spent the better part of the spring making his skepticism about the kitchen operation known in the particular way of a man who is wrong, and knows it but commits anyway, sat at the end of the table and ate 2 full plates, and then a piece of pie, and said, to no one in particular and everyone in general, "I thought the wagon idea was foolish." "We know, Gus," Cal said. "I'm saying I was wrong about it." The table was briefly quiet, because Gus Prater admitting error was an event rare enough to command a moment of attention. "I know you were," Marin said from the range without turning around. It was not unkind. It was just true. Gus made the sound he made when he was accepting something. "Well," he said, and picked up his fork, and that was the whole of it. By November, the operation looked like this. 5 wagons running 6 days a week across 4 Pacific Meridian camps. A supply chain running through Casper and now, increasingly, directly from a wholesaler in Cheyenne that Marin had identified through Lenora's freight connections. A prep kitchen at the ranch that ran from 3 in the morning to noon 6 days a week, staffed by Clara, 2 women from Harwick who had needed work and were reliable, and a teenage boy named Jess, who'd shown up at the ranch yard in September asking if there was anything he could do and turned out to be excellent at moving heavy supply crates without being asked twice. Ada ran the northern route with the authority and efficiency of a woman who had found, in this unexpected arrangement, something that fit her considerably better than the solitary grief of an empty claim. She and Marin talked twice a week by letter when they couldn't meet in person. Short, practical letters about road conditions and supply needs, and the particular logistical puzzles that came with winter approaching, but also sometimes other things. Ada wrote about what she was saving toward. Marin wrote back about what they were building toward. They were not the same thing, but they ran alongside each other comfortably. Elias managed the cattle operation with a steadiness and focus that had been dormant in him for years, freed by the absence of the debt pressure that had been the constant undertone of everything. He had bought 12 new head in the August sale, and the north pasture was running clean and full for the first time in Marin's memory of it, which was admittedly only 9 months. But Dalt told her it was the best the north pasture had looked in 6 years. Elias and Marin had fallen into a working partnership that was, by November, the actual shape of their marriage rather than the framework of it. They made decisions together at the kitchen table, disagreed about specific things with enough comfort to say so directly, and had learned which problems each of them was better suited to carry. It was not perfect. Nothing about it was perfect. Marin still burned things occasionally, and still got up in the night sometimes to recalculate supply numbers in her head when she should have been sleeping. Elias still went silent in a way that took a day to work through when something on the cattle side went wrong. The roads north were getting worse as winter came in, and there had been 2 supply delays in October that had required emergency workarounds that cost money they'd rather have kept. The 6th Pacific Meridian camp was still uncertain. The surveying dispute had not resolved, and Lenore had warned in her last letter that the board was debating the timeline. These were the facts of the operation, unglamorous and ongoing, the daily weight of a thing that was real. One evening in late November, Marin walked out to the north pasture alone. It was cold enough that she could see her breath, and the light was going fast in the way it did in Wyoming this time of year, not gradually but decisively, as if the sun had somewhere more important to be. The cattle in the north pasture were moving slowly toward the feed station Elias had set up along the east fence line, their breath clouding in the dusk. The grass was dry and winter pale, but there was enough of it, and the supplemental feed was consistent, and the animals had the look of animals that were being properly kept. She stood at the fence and watched them and thought about the woman who had come here in March on a freight wagon with 2 trunks and a cast iron skillet and a husband who hadn't looked her in the eye. She had come here to survive. That had been the whole plan. Survive, be useful, make herself indispensable enough that the arrangement held. She had not come here expecting to build something. She had not come here expecting to find, in the specific difficulty of this place and this life, anything that felt like belonging. But here was what she had learned over 9 months on the Wyoming frontier that she had not known before she arrived. Belonging is not a thing that is given to you when you show up somewhere. It is not in the room waiting, and it does not come because you need it or deserve it or work hard enough to merit it. It is a thing that is made, slowly, through the accumulation of small decisions, through the choice to say what you're thinking when staying quiet would be safer, through the choice to send a letter when not sending it would be easier, through the choice to get up at 3 in the morning because the work needs doing and you are the one who can do it. She had made those choices because she had no better options, which was honest. But she had also made them because, somewhere in the making of them, she had stopped waiting to feel like she belonged, and had simply started behaving like someone who did. And the belonging had come, not all at once, not cleanly, but in pieces. In the way Dalt moved to help her without being asked, in the way Cal had quietly stopped making comments about the kitchen and started asking what needed doing, in the way Elias had learned to drive toward her wagon on the ranch yard and not away from it at the end of a long day. She had not fixed this ranch. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. The drought had broken on its own. The cattle market had moved in favorable directions that had nothing to do with her. Elias had made 100 decisions before she arrived that had kept the property viable when lesser men might have walked away. What she had done was find the thing that the ranch could not have seen for itself, because it was too close to its own exhaustion to look outward, and she had pushed until it became real. That was enough. That was more than enough. She heard footsteps behind her, the particular sound of Elias's boots on frozen ground, and he came and stood beside her at the fence. He did not ask what she was doing out here alone in the cold. He just stood there, which was one of the things she had come to know about him. He did not require everything to be explained. After a while, he said, "Oh, Lenora sent a wire this afternoon. The 6th camp is confirmed. They broke ground yesterday." Marin kept her eyes on the cattle. "When do they need us operational?" 60 days. That's tight. I know. We'll need to talk to the Casper carpenter about a 6th wagon. I was thinking we might build this one ourselves, Elias said. Dalt and I, we've watched it done enough times. She looked at him. He was looking at the pasture, not at her. But there was something in the way he said it. The quiet, easy confidence of a man who had stopped measuring what he could attempt against what he'd failed at before. "That would save money," she said. "It would." He paused. "And I want to know we can do it." She understood that. She understood it more completely than she could have said in words, because it was exactly the same thing she had felt standing over that first wagon setup in the equipment barn 9 months ago, looking at a cracked axle and a dream of a railroad camp 2.5 miles down a rough road. She turned back to the pasture. "Then we build it," she said. He nodded. They stood there in the cold as the last light left the sky, and the cattle settled in for the night, and the ranch made its familiar sounds around them. The horses, the wind, the creak of the equipment barn door that needed fixing and would get fixed eventually when there was a free morning for it. There was a version of this story, Marin knew, that ended with everything solved. The debt paid, the contract signed, the villain removed, the ranch saved, all the pieces in their right places, smooth and resolved. That was the version people liked to tell, because it had a shape to it that felt like meaning. But the actual story, the one she was living inside, did not end. It continued. Tomorrow there would be 3:30, and the range and the biscuits and the cold drive north and the line of hungry men and the tin box filling up, and there would be something that went wrong and something that needed fixing and something she hadn't anticipated and would have to think through on the drive back. There would be a day when the supplies were short and a day when the weather turned bad and a day when she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. Those days were coming. They were always coming, on the Wyoming frontier, on any frontier, the ones inside you as much as the ones outside. What she had learned, what 9 months of early mornings and bad roads and a man who said send it had taught her. was that the difficulty was not the enemy of the life she was building. It was the material it was built from. Every problem she had solved had made the next one more solvable, not because she had gotten lucky, but because she had gotten practiced. She had gotten practiced at looking at a hard thing and asking, not why is this happening to me, but what does this need, and do I have it? She almost always had it. Not everything she needed every time, not perfectly, not without cost, but enough. She had enough, and the people around her had enough, and together they were building something that was adding up to more than the sum of its difficult parts. The stars were out now, sharp and close the way they got in Wyoming in November when the air was cold and clear. She had not noticed them in March, too preoccupied with survival to look up. She noticed them now. Elias shifted beside her, ready to go in from the cold, and she turned with him, and they walked back across the ranch yard toward the lit windows of the house, toward the warmth of it, the specific warmth that a house holds when it is no longer just a structure, but a place where work has been done and rest has been earned, and tomorrow is something you are moving toward rather than something that is coming for you. She had arrived here with a cast-iron skillet and a plan to survive. She was leaving the pasture with a cattle ranch that was clear of debt, a food supply operation serving 6 railroad camps across the Wyoming frontier, a business partner who was also her friend, a husband who was also her partner in the truest sense of that word, and a community of people whose lives were materially different because she had looked at a column of smoke on the horizon and asked how many men were eating beneath it. Not bad? For 9 months? Not bad at all.